oil reserves and production. In times of crisis, pleasure having Professor Cleveland on. One can read. And Professor Cleveland today has some slides. And please, Cleveland, ask me to show the slides when you want
Okay.
it. Please, if you could start. So,
Yeah.
Clev.
What we were going to talk about basically needs an assessment of the impact, say, of an individual country in world geopolitics, and that requires looking not just at reserves, which aren't currently being produced, but also at the production rate, and also at what the country actually uses, exports or imports. But in general, we look at reserves because that's the powerhouse image, and the production because that's what's happening in the world. If you put the first slide there, I just want to show
Sure.
that.
Let me interrupt only to show that Jorge Oliveira is with us
Oh,
today. Welcome, Jorge. Thank you.
yeah, nice to have you again, George.
This first slide here.
Yeah, you see, I follow a lot of data from many sources. IEA, the U.S. The EIA, the OPEC puts out data. The BP used to put out reports. Nowadays, it's the Energy Institute and other companies as well. It's important to follow that. For this reference here, I just use Wikipedia because they have production, reserves, and actual consumption by countries. So this is more or less our reference. We don't have to use that. Now, but I did want to talk about some countries because individual countries are what is moving world geopolitics right now, especially in these times of crisis, wars, and oil prices moving around sometimes in unexpected directions. Because in the old days, we assumed that anytime you have conflicts, oil prices have to be high. And nowadays, we recognize that it's the balance that counts, is not whether there is strife or not. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some specific countries that affect, or at least the expectation that they might affect, how the oil will behave. And first off, for example, Venezuela is supposed to have the largest reserves in the world, but it's only the 21 in oil production, 700 and some thousand. So it's not very significant in production. Also, it's not very likely that its production is very stable because it's subject to sanctions and technical
Political
problems and
issues.
so on.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, we have to temper reserves, which are illusory in the case of Venezuela, are all very heavy oil that's not likely to ever be produced.
But
So
that's a
that,
good point, Professor. Sorry to interrupt you, but it's a huge reserve. But at the same time, have oil, and they require support from technology
yeah,
companies that they do not have. So how
exactly.
does it work?
That is a very uncomfortable position. They were just given a little breather when the U.S. thought it would be a good idea to have a little extra production in the world. Let them produce 250,000 barrels a day more. But that's short-lived. It won't last very long. And Venezuela needs very light oil imports to mix with its heavy oil to produce that. It does have reserves of good offshore oil, but those are not very likely to be produced because you need long-term projects, investment. The country can't produce that on its own. So, those are basically all stranded resources. And, for all intents and purposes, if they stay at 500 to 700,000 barrels per day, fine. They are not any kind of a moderating influence. They produce all they can, and it isn't a lot. But Saudi Arabia, for example, also has large reserves. Also, as we discussed some programs ago, very overstated reserves. 260 billion barrels, maybe more in some assessments from OPEC, naturally, but that's 30% overstated, more likely to be half of that. That's unfortunately the reality of the world.
But I suppose is light oil in this case, no?
Yeah, it's light oil. Obviously, their production is large. They do have some spare capacity, so they can continue to act a little bit as that moderating influence in the market, which they used to have in a big way. But remember, their budget constraint makes them need all the revenue that they can get their hands on. So it's very costly for them to produce 9 million instead of 10 because their budget requires 10. And oil prices being soft is a very big problem for them. And for many other OPEC countries, which budgeted their expenses at 100, 110, some countries $120 oil, and the oil is at 80. So
Yeah,
obviously, the big crunch.
and 9 million barrels a day is a huge amount of money. Where they put this money every day?
They're spending money like there's no tomorrow. They're spending money even in alternative energies. So if you want to spend a lot of money, spend a lot of money on solar panels all over the place and all of this. It's it doesn't make too much sense, but maybe they were a little bit forced into that from a maybe a risk averse position.
Yeah.
But it really is a very big drain on their budget. And of course, they spend a lot of money on military expenses
Yeah.
and some of the welfare state they have and so on. Saudi Arabia and some of the other OPEC countries have been spending a lot of money on new cities and all that kind of
And
stuff.
and
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 it's
mo-
not going to change their economies.
and the most part of this production they export, specifically for the United States, I suppose.
Well, some to the United States, but not as much as before. And I think this is important. The energy independence movement, which is really an energy security. No one is independent. But the energy security movement around the world, even China and so on, seek to at least diversify their sources of imports. So whereas Saudi Arabia used to have exporting to specific countries, particularly the U.S. a long time ago, now it's more spread out because that is important for the importers, and it's important for Saudi Arabia to diversify its risk also. But it is in a less comfortable position than before because it can't exercise its moderating influence like it did in the past. In fact, it's very anxious to increase production even at these prices.
And
That's the problem.
are they protected against wars, invasions, and to stop
No,
production, or
we spoke.
vulnerable?
Yeah, we spoke about that some time ago. Saudi Arabia, the Middle East in general, it is a powder keg. The war can be in Israel, in Hamas, and so on, but it's so easy to spill over not just the war itself, but the impacts of the war. That Saudi Arabia, certainly Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, United Emirates, and so on, they are all subject to that extreme risk that things can spread and countries can all of a sudden have restrictions and so on. So that's a very limiting factor on their maneuverability. Iran is number 3 in reserves, maybe number 7 in production, so it's significant and also exports a lot, but it's subject to the same problems. Iran, Iraq,
Yeah,
and
but
other.
do they have protection from the United States or not? So they are standalone.
If you ask anybody nowadays, do they have the protection from the U.S.? Ask Taiwan how they feel. That protection, which used to be rock solid, I think now it's like Jello. You can stick your finger in it. Unfortunately, they cannot rely on that. Sure, the United States has just sent more aircraft carriers and so on. It will try to cool down, any impacts because it would be bad for the world economy. But none of those countries can say, "Oh, we've got this relationship. The U.S. is going to." No, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Maybe for Japan or something like that, but not for the Middle East. Despite the importance of energy of the Middle East to the world energy, because of the fact that it's just almost intractable solution. You can't go there and defend because it's a powder keg, and all can catch fire. So it's a very uncomfortable position, and the best that they can do is produce as much as they can, because they're going to be left with tremendous resources under the ground at the end of the oil age, even if that's in 2100, because they will not be able to increase their production very much.
That's a good point. So, Venezuela and Saudi Arabia are totally opposite. And what's
Yeah.
more important for a country, to have huge reserves
No, to have huge production. Yeah,
production?
that is the influential part. So, in terms of production, that can be a big factor in the world oil markets. And exactly for that reason, for example, I like to talk a lot about the U.S. because its reserves are officially something like 50 billion barrels. I think it can be increased a lot because shale basins have not been assessed into reserves. So it could easily be 100 billion barrels and more. But that's not the point. The point is that it is the largest oil producer, 13.5 or something like that, million barrels a day, and it can increase that. It's likely to increase another 500,000 barrels in the next couple of years. It's likely to increase another million or two. So you're talking about a country that's going to be influential in the world oil markets, certainly in terms of energy independent security, because it has the production, but almost independence as well, and also a big player in liquefied LNG, liquefied natural gas. So you're talking about a country that is already influential, and it's going to be even more influential.
And do they have refineries or they export crude oil only?
No, the advantage of the U.S. is that they have refining capacity that is very disseminated throughout the country. That is a very important uh, risk mitigating factor, because you have refineries that refine heavy oil, some that refine light oil, some that are very flexible. You don't have giant refineries, but you have many. And so the refined products that the country can produce are almost sufficient to make it self-sufficient in refined products.
Okay.
But it is very important for the global oil markets that its excess production in oil will increasingly go into the market. And that makes it very difficult for OPEC to keep its share. In fact, the OPEC share will decrease, and the big players now, in these times of strife, when OPEC and the Middle East are constrained, these are the players that are up and coming. The U.S., I always speak about Brazil, you know that, because Brazil is nearing 4 million barrels, and it's likely to increase that to 5 and 6 over the next 5 years or more. And its resource base is very huge. Its stated reserves are like 13 or 15 million barrels, but the undeclared reserves that are known, that companies are sitting on top of those reserves and they just don't declare because they don't want to have obligations to spend money. But those reserves, there are another 50 billion, and you know that my assessment of just the pre-salt is something like 200 billion barrels. Wow. Is the best estimate. So, it doesn't matter, because we can't just talk about reserves. We have to talk about production. And Brazil's production has been increasing, finally been increasing rather rapidly, just like Guyana and even Suriname are likely to increase production going forward, and they will be players. They are far from strike zones. People say, oh, but Venezuela threatened Guyana. Oh, give
Yeah,
me a break. That's
yeah.
saber rattling. Venezuela is going to do
Let,
nothing.
let me ask you to talk a little bit about the United States, since we have a comment from Dan Miara. Please comment on how the United States is the number one producer despite the current administration's being anti-fossil fuels. Good question, Dan.
Yeah, very good. We spoke last program about Kamala Harris and new energy policies. I think the United States is coming around to the realization. I think the United States administration, the Democratic Party, which was anti-fossil fuels, is coming to that realization that the U.S. is an oil powerhouse, an energy powerhouse, an oil and gas powerhouse, and it is not in its interest to move away from that. It has to produce a lot, and the more the better. And the refining centers in the Gulf of Mexico and bring in offshore production from the Gulf of Mexico, export as much LNG as possible. All of that is consistent with good, sound energy security.
But please allow me to show a video. That's a very interesting video, very short, less than one
Yeah.
1 second.
Yeah.
Video file here.
Offshore drilling?
Yes. And I've, again, worked on that.
Again,
So would you ban offshore drilling?
Yes. And I've, again, worked on that.
so she will ban every oil production in the
People
country.
are sorry that they said certain things, and I think this is the case in point. Moving forward, she has said, "No, I'm not against fracking anymore." Of course not. How can you be? That is the basis of the oil industry nowadays. People have to recognize that.
Back into your map. So United States is a 20 million barrels a day consumption, and the internal production is around 20, a little bit less than 20.
Production. What they do nowadays is they count oil and biofuels because they end up substituting transportation biofuels. So that's why the 13.5 million barrels a day in oil production is complemented with another 6 or 7 million barrels in other fuels and so on. But the United States is in the enviable position of having, of course, a very large consumption and production, but very balanced. And it has the opportunity to be a major player in the oil markets for a very interesting reason. It's SPR, this Strategic Petroleum Reserve. It was, the capacity is like 700 million barrels, 715 million barrels. Before the pandemic, it was close to that. It was, I think, 650 or something. And then they released a lot of oil, so the prices wouldn't be so high. And now...
Yeah, but with Democrats, they are planning to stop this production.
No, that's not the case. In fact, I think they just announced that the SPR is going to buy oil and put it into the SPR. You only put oil into the SPR if you think you're going to use it and produce it sometime. The one thing is lip service to energy transition, net zero, and so on, and the other is realities of economics. You have to run an economy, just as you and I have discussed many times. Even in the energy transition, the oil and gas will be a major part of the energy mix in the world for the next 30 years or more, maybe 50
or more.
So it's inescapable, and they have to run the SPR as they have been as a moderating influence in the market, and they made a lot of money in it actually, because they sold oil when it was high.
Yeah, but look, Professor, 700 million barrels of SPR and a consumption of 20 million barrels a day is not so long. It's 3 months consumption.
Yeah, that's the objective. China has the same objective. It also wants to have 90 days of consumption in its SPR.
But it's too little considering the strategic vision of the country. It's only to protect for wars.
You know why it isn't? Because production doesn't go to zero. in the United States
Yeah.
or anywhere else. So,
That's
so
right.
you don't really have to have production to compensate the entire consumption.
Right.
You know, that 700 million barrels will last a very long time if the production is reduced by 20% or if import. So it lasts a very long time. In fact, it's there more as a balancing force because that's what it has been. And now I think we're entering another phase where the SPR is going to be increasing again because the oil prices are so cheap. Their objective is to buy oil at under $80 or under 79. If they fill up several million barrels more now until the end of the year, that will be a lot.
You mean that if you have a crisis, a very important crisis, so United States is protected in this case because
Oh, yes.
it has SPR and
Yeah.
internal production and
Yeah.
control of geopolitics,
Yeah.
geopolitics vision of the world too.
And that example has been followed to the letter by China because its SPR is emulating the U.S. You know, it's smaller. I think it's 300 or 400 or so million barrels, but it's working on increasing that and it's working on filling that. And once it does that, it knows it's never going to go to zero imports. They will have maybe trouble importing from Saudi Arabia or maybe from somewhere else. But if they have an SPR that has 300 million barrels, they don't have to worry too much. 6 months later, they can move things around.
Yeah, we have a question from
Yeah.
Mansley. What's the maximum daily drawing capacity of the SPR? The system
that's
monthly.
Yeah, it's very important to know how much you can produce from the SPR. That answer is almost non-existent because it depends on when. If you had to say today, can we take out 10 million barrels a day? No, obviously they couldn't. Maybe they could take out 2 or 3. If that lasts for a month or more, maybe they can increase it. And that is also reasonable because crises happen, but the effects aren't always immediate. You know, there's always oil on the way, ships carrying oil, a country might go to zero, somewhere else doesn't. So that flexibility is very important for the limitations that the SPR has. Just like China also has the same type of limitations. They're putting in as much as they can, buying oil when it's cheap.
Yeah, but,
and they did that from Russia and so on.
But his point includes something interesting. Process components like pumps, for instance, that can be limited in terms of crisis.
No, more than a couple million a day. Yes, in a dire crisis, they could pump more, but not immediately. It would probably take a month or more. But that's fine because in a month or more, you don't asphyxiate from lack of oil. So this is all, it's not by chance. And this is a risk aversion strategy that is very important for the U.S. as it is for China. India, for example, on the other hand, which is also the consumer and so on, small produces less than 1 million barrels a day, or 500,000 or something.
That's a
good point.
Yeah, it's a good point to talk about India because we talk about Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and USA. You mentioned India. India has internal production, the strongest internal production.
Minimal. I think it's 600,000.
Wow.
So
it's
nothing. It depends on imports, and it has almost no resources either. Maybe
from Russia for
yes.
Sure.
And it's acting like China as a support for very low prices. If a country is desperate to export oil like Russia was, they'll be the takers. But they can't do anything else of that.
But this is a good point. So is it vulnerable for India to depend on Russia?
Yeah, it's maybe you could say, it was lucky that it could buy cheap oil from Russia and so on. China did that, but China did it much better because it bought much more than it needed and put it into its SPR. India
Okay.
doesn't have any SPR, so it buys what it uses. If crisis comes back again, they have
Stop.
no spare.
Stop means stop.
Yeah, that is a very critical situation for India. I don't know what they're doing about it. I didn't check local politics, but that is one of the things that the new administration will have to consider, because no big country like India can operate under the world geopolitical scenario, which is full of risk, without an SPR. Maybe a little country can say, "Oh, we can always import 100,000 barrels," but to import 4, 5, 6 million barrels, you need an SPR.
Dan sent another point, another comment. Of course, he is interested in the United States situation. The current administration has seen light on fossil fuels. Why they continue to promote the Green Deal?
The Green New Deal is not really about green fuels and so on. The Green Deal is an industrial policy, and I'm not sure I would agree with that. But
For the supply chain, you mean?
Yeah, that's basically what it is. So if you provide incentives here, right, left, and investments like crazy for solar plants or whatever, it certainly provides some development, some support for GDP and so on. But it's not. It's called the Green New Deal, like many other government programs. Maine has nothing to do with the reality.
But Professor, with the increasing dependence on minerals and equipment and systems from China to develop some new energy like wind and solar, so this is a kind of vulnerability that the United States is coming over.
Yeah, that was more, I would say, the objective was to provide some balance in the economy, to make it robust, so that if China were to limit exports and so on, domestic production in the U.S. would be supplied by alternative energies, would develop new routes for production. There's all kinds of agreements being signed for mining ventures. A lot of U.S. companies in Brazil, for example, right now, looking for critical minerals, because Brazil has a lot of unprospected.
But the dependence is high, extremely high. So
yes, but how do you address that? You address that by starting all over to develop new sources. And again, seems the U.S. is lucky.
This
critical minerals
is something that the United States is trying to do and was not feasible for them.
Well, I think it's more feasible than people thought. There is a lot more potential for production of critical metals and minerals in the U.S. than people realize. And many critical minerals, for example, lithium, are available from the oil patch, from oil industry installations. That is something that was unimaginable 5 years ago. Nowadays, Exxon and so on have plans to produce tremendous amounts of lithium.
Professor, 8% of equipment, materials, and source for the new energies are from China, and it's not being transformed. This situation today in the United States.
I think it's
Brazil
being transformed. I think it's being transformed on a path that takes maybe 5 years. Sure, if something happens before 5 years, we're going to have a big problem throughout the world. But if that dependency is reduced 5 or 10% per year over the next 5 to 6 years, we should be fine. Okay. And I think that is what's going to happen.
Okay, let me suggest we talk a little bit about China. The
interesting thing about China is that everybody is very scared of its dominance over critical minerals, over its exports of solar panels, wind equipment, and so on. But if you look at that, China has limited oil resources, so it had to look for these alternatives. It was compelled to do so. It was a smart move, but it was a natural move. It is not a very large oil producer, 4-point-something million barrels a day, as you can see. So, this is a very important strategic objective for a country to try to reduce its dependency. just as other countries are trying to reduce their dependency on solar panels, for example. But as long as China has tremendous excess capacity for solar panels, it is in everybody's interest to import cheap solar panels to develop their solar
But-
energy at cheap cost, and
But
China
in term-
will continue to export.
Yeah. In terms of oil production reserves, are they comfortable in this?
No, they're not. That's why they're looking to increase.
For alternative, yeah, I got that.
But the other
uh,
strategy is
from
to
where
look
they
outside. China is
Yeah,
a big investor in Brazil. It's a big
yeah
investor in Africa.
from where they import oil and data.
China is importing significant amounts from Brazil and will import significant amounts from other new producers, including Guyana, for example. It knows it has to balance out its oil import sources and not be dependent only on the Middle East, which it has reduced its dependence a lot.
And I saw they are constructing several refineries, new refineries at this time.
Yeah, this is a value-added type strategy, and I think it makes sense. They have the capital, or they had the capital to invest in refineries, which are a very expensive proposition. But once that gets going, of course, the numbers work out. China has been very successfully doing this. While it needs to export all of the critical minerals and panels that people are so concerned that they're concentrated in their hands, but China can't afford to limit those. They will export as much as they can because they have to. So, this is a concentration of supply that worries a lot of people, but if the supplier is compelled to continue supplying, that is not as worrisome as in other circumstances. So I think things are actually falling into place. Not to say that the world is a safe place, but in terms of dependency, as long as China is compelled to export all of its excess panels and the world has no alternatives, that's fine. The world will benefit from cheap solar panels from India.
Cross dependency.
Yeah, and from China, and even India is benefiting, while, that 4 or 5 years from now, their sources of oil can increase so they can also feel their dependence. It works both ways. Just as we are concerned about having concentration of imports from China, they're concerned about having to import their energy.
We talked about Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, United States, India, China. Is there another country you want to?
No, I would say that's it because, for example, we know that Guyana and even Suriname will become major players later. Some African countries will add maybe 500,000, 1 million here or there, so they will increase. All of that spells more trouble for OPEC in the Middle East because, if there's more production outside of OPEC, OPEC will be constrained. But that is actually good for the world. I think Brazil will be a player also. Some African countries have the problem of, country risk and even reputational risk if the country is involved in corruption schemes. But here and there, majors know how to pick some countries. Mozambique, Angola, Namibia, those have the best chances.
Okay.
Other than South American countries, Brazil and Guyana, there's basically nothing there. Argentina is not going to be a major player. There's no other players there. Mexico, forget it. So, it's a constrained geopolitical situation.
Yeah. You sent to me 2 slides, and I have one more.
Yeah, there's a last slide that I just wanted to talk a little bit, just to reinforce the point that I made before. It's unquestionably the United States, whether one wants it that way or not, is going to be the big player in the oil and gas world. Rystad did this study, independent of the assessments of BP and OPEC and so on. They came up with big numbers for U.S. reserves, 100 and some billion, 190 billion barrels. So Russia, smaller numbers, and that I think Russia production is going to come down a lot. It points to the increasing weight of the U.S. in oil and also in LNG. And this is an unescapable truth because no other country has been able to grow production as fast as the U.S. And it still has the potential to grow from offshore production. So it seems to have everything falling into place. That is
Okay.
the future.
Let me ask my last point for you, please. What's the probability for geopolitical instability in these next weeks and months?
No, I don't think the chances are so high very short term. I think until the end of the year, we will have 6 months or beyond a little bit the end of the year. The next 6 months, we will have heightened crisis levels. But in terms of major happenings, probably not so much. It's in no one's interest. China doesn't want that. Russia may because it doesn't have that much to lose, but it's already in a very fragile situation. China has basically dominated the
So you mean that all tensions are controllable?
I think at this point, yes. If we have a flare-up, we will probably see oil prices get to $100 again, and then we'll come back down because the supply and demand equilibrium price is what we have been seeing. It's near $80 or $90, not much more.
Perfect. Okay, my conclusion is a video.
Offshore drilling?
Yes. And I've, again, worked on that.
Yes,
Thank
we're
you so
working
much.
on that.
Thank you so much, Professor Cleveland. It was a pleasure.
Okay, take care, everybody.
Thank you.